Hi, everyone. Welcome to Annenberg Intelligence. I'm going to do what I always do when I start these sessions, which is have you all welcome you, invite you to turn on your camera to say hello, but certainly welcome you to turn your mics on and say hi and good morning. Nice to see you all. Hi, everybody.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Good morning.
Hello, everybody.
Morning.
We have a phenomenal conversation planned for you all today, so welcome. Torod Neptune, Chief Communication Officer and Worldwide Vice President of Marketing for Lenovo Group, is our guest today. He's had an extremely interesting career. In his early days, a journalist, then transitioning to public relations and communication roles, working on the agency side at We Communication and also in corporate roles. And today in his role as Chief Communication Officer at Lenovo, which is among the world's largest manufacturers of computers, PCs, smart devices, and top supplier of supercomputers, among other things. He oversees the company's reputation, products, brand events, social marketing, stakeholder engagement, and advocacy. In addition to his work at Lenovo, his day job, one of the things I find so remarkable about Torod is that he really invests both his time and his energy into supporting the professional growth of a talent pipeline for the industry. He is on the board of advisors at UNC's Hussman School, and he's also on Annenberg Center for Public Relations board, and we're really lucky to have him with us today. Joining me today as co-moderators are Emily, Shon, and John. Jonathan is a first year and Emily is a second year in our PR and advertising program. So Emily and Jonathan, great to have you with us as well. Everybody who's participating, we're going to save plenty of time for your questions. So as usual, go ahead and use the chat, and then I'll call on you and you can open your mic and ask your question yourselves. Torod, welcome. Fantastic to see you here.
Thank you. Excited to be here with you guys.
As you and I discuss, I want to cover a handful of topics with you today. Your role at Lenovo and how you think about brand purpose at a massive global tech firm. Your call to action, I might call it a demand for action, really to increase representation in the public relations industry. And then maybe end with some advice for our students who are considering the field of public relation and communication. Mm-hmm. So if I may, I'd like to have you share with us a little bit about what I was jokingly referring to as your day job, since you do spend such an enormous amount of time in your work working with schools and students. When I look at the list, when I go to your bio and your website and I go to the list of the things that you oversee, things like marketing analytics, social intelligence, insights teams, global product training, corporate and product PR, SCR, global social, it goes on and on and on. So if somebody says to you, like I'm going to do, what do you really do? How do you really envision your role as Chief Communications Officer? How do you describe it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, and I think this definition has evolved over my career as I've matured and taken on different roles and grown in my responsibility. But I think if I were trying to be as highbrow as possible today, I would suggest that the role I play and that my team at large plays, I often describe as being the conscience of our company. And so we own that collective intellectual runway. I advise our CEO and his team on how to maintain the authenticity of who we are in reality today, tied very closely to who we aspire to be as a business, and that continuum between the two, which is fraught with the reality and honesty of the organizational dynamics that big companies have to address to bring those two divergent areas together. Again, who we are and who we aspire to be. And so that really is where I play. And I think one of the exciting things, I know we'll talk about more, that our discipline increasingly has accountability for in organizations today.
Tell me a little bit about what it feels like to be in your role, as you describe it, the conscience of an organization, and how do you partner with a CEO and a senior leadership team in order to do that?
Yeah, yeah. And so I'd say two things. As everything in our business, I think this is centered around relationships. And this is, again, one of the things I think we functionally are expert at very early on. It's the core of what we do, build relationships. We are connectors, we're integrators, or aggregators, depending on how you think about it. And so that is core to this question of the kind of partnership that I'm able to forge with our CEO and his team. It's ultimately a relationship. But secondarily, I'd suggest the degree to which I'm able to be successful or not boils down to, again, another thing I know we'll talk about, because I think it is so significant to what everyone on this call ultimately will do in their careers, which is really move very quickly from being PR, comms people, marketing people, however we describe the roles we play, to, I hope at some point very earlier in your career, becoming business leaders who understand how to pull the levers of communications or PR or marketing to drive an outcome. From my vantage point, a business outcome that our CEO would say is critical to him and our organization in order for us to succeed at the end of the day. And so that continuum as well is an unbelievably fascinating role, and it is a different way to think about what organizations need, that at programs like the ones that you all are a part of are teaching you, that is more significant than some of the tactical things that you'll learn throughout your academic career. And so I think very early on, I had the benefit of working with a boss, a CEO, who challenged me to stop seeing myself as the PR person around the table, and to first see myself as a business leader who is there to support his outcomes, the business outcomes that we have to deliver, but who more than anyone understands every one of the communications PR levers that could be pulled to activate that. And so that may sound like a little bit of play amongst words, but it is a critical distinction to think about the value that you all are learning to bring to an organization, expressed in a different way than the PR person in the room.
Thank you for that. I think it is a critical distinction. And, you started this by saying that if I'm going to be more highbrow about it, and I almost stopped you to say, well, what do you mean by highbrow? And now I understand you're talking about higher order, higher level, beyond the tactics that are critically important, and really understanding the levers and how to work them, critically important. But this higher order purpose for business leaders.
Yes.
Right. And not I won't say relegated, because that's not fair, but not in any way diminished by PR and comms, but elevated by that function to really have a seat at the table and be critical to business outcomes.
Yes.
So, one of the things we've been talking about a lot through this series of conversation is the notion of purpose-driven brands. And why that is so important today. And, as you shared with me, part of your job is to define for stakeholders, both internal stakeholders and external stakeholders, why Lenovo matters. What's its purpose? What are its values? Why is that so important? You make great products and you deliver them a great value. So isn't that enough of a purpose? Why has it become so essential to have this notion of value, purpose, and meaning drive a brand?
Yeah, I think and we all hear this a lot today. And I would suggest, back to the value that we bring, and that discussion, that if you look at the way consumers at large, big C, the way the consumer marketplace has evolved, and again, all of us as buyers of stuff have evolved, and certainly you can look at this across demographics, whether it's Gen Z, Gen Y, Gen X, whatever it might be. We know increasingly from the data that we look at, and we look at this globally across the world, that increasingly we care less and less about the things, and the things don't differentiate us as brands. Again, so I'll talk about a little bit of the reputation polling that we do today across 20 markets around the world, and then globally against a bazillion competitors, and we slice it a million different ways. But one of the more significant golden threads that we see consistently across these data sets is that consumers tell us at some point, when you make products and when you're a big company, we give you the benefit of the doubt. If you're big, you make products, and you probably make pretty good products. But at the end of the day, the question becomes, why should I care? What differentiates the stuff you do beyond the gadgets, widgets, battery life, screen size, and those kinds of things? And then how does that answer create an emotional, connective relationship between us and you, us, the brand, and you, the consumer? And that, again, we see growing at each increment of this data that we capture as a differentiator across our marketplace. Consumers tell us, I don't want to know what you make, I want to know why. Because I don't want to have a transactional relationship with you. More importantly, when I buy a thing from you, I am buying into who you are and what you believe and the role you play in the world. And so that reality increases the obligation that we have as a brand to understand what levers do we need to influence to create this emotive, connective, authentic relationship with our publics, as opposed to just marketing to them or selling the thing to them, because just selling relegates it to a transaction that has nothing to do with who you are, who I am, what I care about, what motivates me, what engages me. And it's all about the buying and selling, which again is not something that's going to allow me to create a long-term relationship with you that helps me build a sustainable business and a product portfolio.
Thank you for that. One of the ways in which you do that is to pull the lever, if you will, of storytelling.
Yeah.
And I asked you if you could share a specific example of this with us. And we're going to show everybody a trailer for a global campaign that you launched called New Realities with Ava DuVernay. Do you want to set it up for a second? I know Emily has a question about how you conceived of it, but maybe just give us a quick setup and we'll play the trailer and then I'll let Emily take it.
Yeah, so I think in this aspiration for us to figure out this relevant, this emotional, connected story for us, one of the things that we believe that you're beginning to see show up throughout all of our, campaigns is this view that, okay, technology is technology. At the end of the day, it's of no value unless it solves some problem, can solve some problem. We think in this environment where a lot of the fundamental things that we all subscribe to are being challenged, namely what makes us all human, what connects us all, that technology has a role to bring those two together, who we are as people, as a society, as humans, and the empathy that we must have as people to understand, even though we may look, think, behave, come from different backgrounds, there is a fundamental place where we are all the same, and we believe technology can have an outsized role in making that connection, and that's what this campaign was designed to begin to do.
Have you ever thought about how young women see the world? How often do we hear from young women? What do they want from the future?
To change the world, we must act together.
I had to escape from my fears.
Get ready to have your mind blown by this 360 film series, New Realities. Innovative virtual reality technology means you can walk through a portal and hear from young women themselves.
When I feel like drowning in all of the bad experiences and all of the bad things I've gone through, I think about my mom, my sisters, my grandmothers, my Syrian aunts right behind me.
Together, the 10 stories build into a picture of an entire generation transcending borders, using smarter technology, and actively working for a better world.
we can seize this moment and make a difference.
This is a new generation offering a new reality, an alternative view of the world, and a different future. Don't take it from me. Hear it from the girls themselves. Watch the films in a headset or online at lenovo.com/newrealities.
That's great, and with a 360 lens, it's really quite amazing. Emily, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Okay, great. Yeah, I was just wondering if you could explain a little bit more about how you conceptualized this campaign, just all the intricacies of this design, how did you decide to select Ava DuVernay to spearhead this and amplify this brand purpose and amplify the stories of these underrepresented young girls, why 360 as well?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and and I sent a lot more detail that at some point hopefully you'll get a chance to look at. But I'll say the beginnings of all of this, and this was months and months and months in the makings, was again I referenced a ton of the data that we have gleaned over the last 2 years, 3 years around this consumer psyche, this shift. And to be quite frank, research we were doing to understand what the global consumers' perspective really were on technology at large, both in terms of what it has done and hasn't done. We have the benefit of being a company. I mean, we make a lot of stuff. I saw the last stats. We sell about 250 devices every minute around the world, and so that's a massive amount of stuff. But we really forced ourselves a couple of years ago to begin to ask the question of whether that really mattered in any significant, meaningful way. And thus began this research to look at the concept of empathy and where we think technology could enable people to have a lens into how similar we are from literally different pockets of the world. And then again, we saw data and research that substantiated for us that women as an audience, given some of the buying decision-making power that we know about them globally, were probably the most credible audience to begin to unpack this concept of what if we could prove that technology in the right hands of an audience, in this instance women, from unbelievably different backgrounds, unbelievably challenged backgrounds, was the core enabler of them doing phenomenal kinds of things. And again, if you get the chance to dig a little deeper into some of these stories, from the Syrian refugee to the first blind deaf lawyer to ever be graduated from Harvard Law School, who is now literally changing the human rights arena, it was that view to pull through the research into an understanding of who this audience was that would be the most credible to help us drive this reality, technology, and empathy, and then a ton of research on a creative expression for that, and thus these 10 stories that we've begun with. That we really took a hands-off approach. Some of them are very raw, but again, back to us being true to allowing these women to tell these stories, so that ultimately our belief was that as we engage them, we would all see that collective humanity, even though some of them are unbelievably painful stories, and that we'd also make the tie of technology being the leveling factor across these communities, demographic groups, and the world. So there's a lot there, but again, it was the beginning of some of those thoughts that drove all of this thinking.
We're going to put, Torod, we're going to put some of the links in the chat so everybody watching can play around and explore some of those incredible videos. What's the reaction been? It's been unbelievably positive. And so back to the question about the face, you will, of the voice. And so the Ava DuVernay one became pretty clear after, again, a lot of the due diligence that we were doing around the credibility factor. And again, for this, once we honed in on women and these untold stories, where we wanted a real creative, reputable person, not just an entity or a company or a producer that we could pay a ton of money from Hollywood or wherever. And so again, Ava was a part of a very small group of names that bubbled up very quickly
to the surface. We were actually quite surprised that we were able to make the get, because again, you all appreciate just the challenges there. But it was, I mean, literally a mind meld as we engaged in conversations with her about the beginning and the very beginning, because of her passion that she brings, just given the history of the work she has done. And back to our desire to be authentic, kind of brand hands off, but to just use our technology to create these platforms, that became a pretty obvious choice there. And from influencers to media, again, this has only been launched maybe a month now, so it's still early days. But the feedback from my vantage point, given the data that I'm looking at already, is indicative enough that we've hit the right spot. Now we've got to invest and double down, and we've got to be long-term in this commitment, not just be marketers, right, that are trying to drive some quarterly activity, but to see this as core to who we are. And if we believe this issue is real, then we've got to commit to it long-term. And those are the kinds of things that we're making plans for now. So I'm excited about what we're seeing so far.
And I'm smiling because that's illustrative of your role as the conscience, to double down, to invest, that this is a long-term commitment, and not, as effective as it may be as a marketing tool, not simply a one-off marketing tool. Torod, I'm going to switch topics significantly and talk a little bit about what I described as a call to action that you've issued in a very public way, in a very pointed way, to the PR industry, calling out the field for being nearly 90% white, which you describe as, and I'm quoting you, unacceptable for any industry in the 21st century. As you said on social, here's the article that you wrote for PR Week. As you also wrote, now's the time. If we're going to address our industry's lack of diversity, we need real leadership. We know all we need to know, data. Now is time to act. Why was it so important to speak out publicly? Why did you choose to use a kind of inside baseball platform like a PR Week? Walk us through this process, if you would.
Yeah, I think, the last 6 months, 7 months, obviously, beginnings with George Floyd and what we saw happen initially here from the US and then globally. I mean, I think we all experienced that. And so I think for me, this was, as for many of us, it was personal on a number of levels. So I'm the father of 3 African-American boys, who grew up, was raised in the South, and then has been in this industry for almost 30 years now, and can count on, 1 or 2 fingers the number of times that I've not been the only person in the room. And as I've grown in my career, the starkness of that reality becomes even more dramatic. And so back to the conversation we started with here around the challenge of the role that we play, being this authentic guardian of our organizations and our brands, and holding our organization's feet to the fire. My role with our CEO and the team around, if we're going to say it, we got to live it. And I think we all increasingly saw my peers, our CEO peers, global organizations, who all did the right thing in responding, positive statements and affirmations. But this concept that has been around for the last several years of never letting a good crisis go to waste, I think is an inflection moment. And there are fewer and fewer of these that have the ability to align the psyche of a nation, of a society. And I don't think we've seen something of this ilk, maybe not since 9/11 from the US vantage point, that had the emotional rallying potential that the last several months has had. And so in my mind, that was a moment that we had to capture. And more significantly, from the brand client leadership vantage point, I believe that in moments where change is required, those people who have the power to make change must do something. And the role that I play, the stature that I have, the influence I have within an organization is really, at some point in my mind, of little value if I cannot use that power to drive good. And so for me, this moment means I am in a role at a time for a reason that I believe I must seize for my own personal satisfaction. And so that I can look at my 3 sons when I come home and feel like I am who I tell them I am. And that is, I think, the challenge for our industry as well as people who advise, counsel, or trying to get organizations to behave better, to do better, to show up better. We've got to walk that talk. And so we made a very public decision as a company 2.5 years ago in relation to agencies. So we spend about $95 to $100 million a year with agencies. And we've publicly committed to no longer hire an agency that did not commit to diversity on our team and within their agencies.
And what does that look like exactly?
So we required in the last big pitch, if you will, for our global agencies, we consolidated about 10 agencies to one. And then as a part of that process, we required for you to be a part of this, you've got to disclose to us your diversity numbers, leadership, and our staffing account must be done so with diverse talent. And you've got to commit to us if your numbers don't reflect what they should, as defined by our customer base, our employee base, what your plan would be to do that. If you cannot, we will not work with you. If you're a current agency that does not make that commitment, we will no longer pay you to be one of our agency partners. And we have been consistent for that in that reality for the last 3 years. And that's the kind of accountability back to when you have power, you need to use it. And that's what we're trying to do around that space.
Emily, I'm going to turn to you and then Jonathan. But Emily, I know you have a question about using personal power.
Yeah. So as you said in your article, there are so many structural barriers in place that really perpetuate this lack of diversity in the PR industry. And, it's largely up to people who are in positions of power to initiate and follow through with these changes. But I'm sort of wondering how I, at individual level, can help change this agency culture and also.
Yeah. So I'd say 2 things. It's a great question. And, I remember in this discussion about this issue many, many years ago, earlier in my career, and I actually referenced it a little bit in the PR Week op-ed. I remember raising the question of the lack of diversity within that agency where I was to the CEO. And I remember being fearful of my job. This was earlier enough where, these things mattered more so then than they do today. But even at that point early on, I believed that the issue was important enough to me and to others that my voice mattered, even when I was the only one. And I think it is those individual decisions that even though they may feel insignificant and they may feel like they reside in a corner or a pocket of the world somewhere, that are just as significant as my peers and I making the same decision at a different level, about who we're going to hire and who we're not going to hire. And so I would suggest not to minimize that. This issue is important now. The timing is important. And so using your voice at whatever level that means is critical. And I think at the end of the day, I'd say the other piece that's unbelievably important is to speak this concept of, truth to power where we live. And so I think you've got to figure out how to do that for where you are. But if this current environment has done anything, I think it's given us all, regardless of how we look, the excuse to have a point of view and to share it and to raise it in this environment. And so I'd encourage you to do that every opportunity that we get.
Thank you. Emily, you good? Do you need to follow? Because otherwise I'm going to go to Jonathan.
That's okay. You can move to Jonathan. Thank you so much.
Okay. Go ahead, Jonathan. I know you have a question. You've been waiting.
Hi, Torod. I also was interested in knowing what measures Lenovo and other PR businesses are taking to foster LGBTQ inclusion in the workforce, and also how this challenge compares to Black, Indigenous, people of color. Yeah.
So internally, excuse me. So we track all of these KPIs. So if we look at our D&I dashboard, both for my team globally, And then for our company, we are looking at our progress against diversity staffing across ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, you name it. There are about 10 categories around which we divide that. And my compensation is tied to progress in these areas. And so in any given year, the degree to which I'm successful and my peers are successful at driving incremental improvement in these statistics, our hiring, recruitment, and retention across all of these demographics, you'll see meaningful impact on my compensation. And I often challenge our leaders, both agency and otherwise, in relation to, if we want to, I think it was Emily's question, to drive system change, which is what we're talking about, because these are structures and systems that have been in place for eons that have not enabled, women and diverse constituencies to progress in this field. So to drive system change, we've got to go at system, solutions. And that, I think, is one of the reasons that focusing on things like compensation is key, not just, staffing, metrics around how many of any different demographic or ethnic group are we able to hire and retain, but what are we doing to drive, these systems that need to be addressed? That's the real question. So to your point, we look at it across all those dimensions, and we're encouraging our agencies to do the same. And then we evaluate and we release annually publicly our global report, our global dashboard on our performance as a global entity around these staffing levels as well. That's coming up again in the next 6 weeks. So that's the other part of the transparency and accountability. And this is where we're challenging our agencies as well as a part of the same commitment to publicly release their data, because that's really where you get to accountability and transparency in a way that is going to drive system, structural change, not just the marketing of some D&I commitment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Jonathan, I'm throwing you a slight curveball, only that you had a great question that I think is actually related to this that I'm gonna have you ask about underrepresented minorities in the workplace. Go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. So although racial diversity in the workforce has had minor improvements according to what I was able to see from your article, the reality is that, it will continue to be a challenge in society. So I did want to know what advice you have for underrepresented minorities who are breaking into the workforce in terms of like how they can put their foot down and ensure that they're counted and valued for their abilities.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think I'll say two things, and one may not be as PC as the second, but I also think back to this this point I made about my upbringing in the South, and you should read into what that meant and what that entailed in every way that you might imagine. Very clear, very early on, it was clear to me what people expected from me and of me, what they believed about me, and what they thought I could and couldn't do. And I was raised by a mother, though, understanding that, who taught my siblings and I that first and foremost, we had an obligation to prove them all wrong, and to understand who I was, who we were, and what we brought to the table that superseded anyone's perception of who I was and what I brought to the table. And so that confidence, that belief and understanding in who you are and what you bring to the table, your whole self, not as defined by someone else's lens, is an unbelievably powerful place that we've got to begin, particularly the we who look and come from different backgrounds than the traditional communities we're trying to influence. And so that core understanding of who we are and that conviction that in and of itself is value, and we can bring that value to the organizations that we are part of, is key. Now, I say all that to say, there have been moments where I also had to make the decision that I, at this moment, am a part of an organization that I don't believe fundamentally supports who I am. and will not allow me to be my whole authentic self, and therefore I must separate myself. This is not a place for me. And so that strategic decision is something that also I have made in a few instances. That's not painful, that's not pleasant, but allowed me to stay true to who I believed I was. Back to being able to go home and look at my children and my wife at the end of the day and feel confident about I have been for the last 12 hours who I, have told you all I have been my whole life. And so that process is key as well. And it perhaps is more of the responsibility of us than the organizations we're a part of. But there's also, that discipline around, we got to be really thoughtful about the organizations that we attach ourselves to, given this reality. And if fundamentally an organization is not going to value who we are and what we bring to the table and our differences, then we need to make some other decisions as well, as opposed to just laboring someplace that ultimately is not going to do anything for us and is not going to allow us to be fully who we are.
Torod, we're throwing the challenging ones at you today, for sure. Emily, I know you have a question about PR professionals in the industry in a broader sense navigating the space of social justice. You want to ask that one?
Yeah, sure. So I guess with more brands showing their support for Black Lives Matter over this summer and subsequently getting called out on social media for performative activism, I would really argue that it's becoming increasingly important for PR professionals to be able to navigate these social justice spaces. And so, cultural competence, awareness, and understanding of US politics, I think are becoming really integral in PR practice. So I'm just wondering if you believe that this is where the future of PR practice is headed.
I think, again, when we talked about this a little bit in the beginning, given where consumers are going and their expectation for brands and for leaders of brands, CEOs in particular, I think there was some research in the last couple of months. I don't know if it was Edelman or one of the agencies, but again, it substantiates the things we always hear, which is we want CEOs to have a point of view on societal, political, apolitical, geopolitical issues. We want brands to have a voice. And so that reality is not going to lessen. It's probably going to continue to grow. But what I think becomes even more important given that reality, and I think that is your question, and that points to this concept of value for the roles you all will eventually start to play as you join organizations, in terms of this authentic arbiter of who an organization is and desires to be, is going to be even more critical, because I find the bigger challenge, everyone can have a point of view, to your point. Who has not made a positive affirmative statement about the racial justice issues of the last several months? Find an organization, and I think it'll be hard to do. Now, if we went a step further, I shared something around the time that all this was beginning around, great, I appreciate your statement, Mr. or Mrs. Brand. Now show me the makeup of your board of directors. And so what was behind that comment was right, okay, the authenticity of, hey, let's be careful that we don't just all, become marketers of, a support for a cause and an issue. We've got to stay focused to this authentic accountability. And that is back to this role that I believe I play for our organization. We had some very frank and heated discussions, our CEO and I and his leadership team, around the time of the George Floyd incident, because in my mind, we were going to do and say some things that just did not hold reality for us as a global brand. When you look at the business that we operate, the way we operate, and some of the data behind who we are, and that process, that accountability, those conversations are where I believe we are increasingly looked to drive value, not just the PR people with some great creative idea around the next campaign to sell more gadgets, widgets, but again, the arbiters of the conscious of our organizations to say, hold on, wait a minute, we are not Ben and Jerry's. We perhaps should consider whether we've been given the permission by our stakeholders to have a point of view on this topic before we decide we're going to try and market our way out of it. And that discipline and that role, I think, is the role for our collective function as we begin to emerge as one of the more influential seats around the C-suite table, advising our companies, entities, brands on how to authentically engage and drive the business in a way that now, given the reality of the social, racial justice issues, political issues that we're dealing with, is top of mind for not just CEOs and C-suites, but boards of directors who are looking for the same kind of guidance, leadership, and who are also sensitive to, we can't get too far out over our skis because we feel guilty. We've still got to maintain our commitment to being true to who we are, while at the same time pulling ourselves out of this very comfortable place to go beyond not doing or saying anything. And so that's a very long-winded way of saying that I think is going to increase that reality, but the benefit is that it will continue to increase the importance and stature of the roles we can play. Maybe not, we are not playing them across the board, but it is still the opportunity that is not fully realized by my peers and I, that I would suggest, and that is the real opportunity for us to unseat some of our C-suite peers who perhaps have more historical stature than they should have been given.
I'm just making sure, I'm just looking at Emily or Jonathan to make sure that they didn't want to dive in on that. No, okay. I'm going to switch gears a little bit into what I said I wanted to touch upon, which is your advice for students as they build their professional portfolios and think about careers. But one of the interesting things that you pointed to in the PR Week article, I thought, was the ways in which the response to the pandemic actually undercut efforts to diversify the industry. And you cited, eliminating or job eliminations that hit diverse populations very hard, but you also cited the elimination of internship programs and pointing out that, for many companies, and we certainly see this here when we place interns, internships serve as the only consistent pipeline, as you put it, for securing diverse entry-level talent.
Yes.
So I guess my question is, how important are intern programs for talent development in the PR and comms fields? And how should interns feel about their role as helping to diversify the industry?
Yeah. So I think the importance of the internship piece, to that point, that conversation in PR Week, and behind that conversation in PR Week was a ton of conversations, both with our agencies, and then with my industry peers. Because again, the other point I made in the PR Week article is, I understand we're all dealing with kind of the COVID, pre-COVID, post-COVID, needing to ensure we have sustainable, viable businesses and cost and all those things. But again, back to, if I'm committed to this cause of diversity and ensuring that not just we, the people, but my team, my company is diverse, and I'm forced to make decisions between A and B and C, and if C is the lowest cost option of all of the ones available to me and has the most significant influence on a significant part of my diversity commitment, reality, then it makes no sense why I would go down that route of cutting off that, component. Unless I'm short-sighted, and unless perhaps my commitment is not a commitment born out of the reality of how I'm operating as a business leader. And so I think that's what concerned me the most, and that's what led to some very direct conversations with our agency teams, because that pipeline piece, to the second question, is critical, and internships are probably the lion's share of that pipeline. We get most of our entry-level talent from our internship programs globally, not just here in the US. and that is the most significant influencer of the diversity of that pipeline, right? And so that's why we certainly made the decision to double down. We moved our entire internship program online, and then hired, over 100 interns, during COVID for this very reason, to not overly damage our pipeline over the next, few semesters. And so I think for those of you that are considering looking for internships, I'd say they are even more important today than they were. And perhaps to the conversation around us being thoughtful about making sure we're in the right organizations, doing the due diligence to ensure that organizations you're considering working with, interning with, share that view, that these are just not the, kind of the busy positions, the grunt work kinds of roles, even though there's always a little bit of that, but that shouldn't be the majority of what people view as, value for internships. Doing that due diligence as well, in as much as it is possible, to attach yourself to those organizations who have a informed, data-driven view of what's the real value of interns. It is a compelling pipeline for us to find, again, our top talent.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm going to go to you in a second, but I just want to let everybody know, if you do have questions, please go ahead and pop them in the chat, and I will call on you. As you can see, Jonathan and Emily have plenty prepared, so we can keep going. But I really want to make sure that if somebody is participating, that they pop a question in the chat for us. Jonathan, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question regarding what advice you can give to students who aspire to become future leaders in the PR industry, like regarding the perspective and mentality that they should be exercising while they're still at school. And then also if you had any specific advice on like how they can make a difference today regarding the issue of diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, I think mentoring and networking are, unbelievably important. And I talk most often about this, as I interact with students. Again, Dean Bay mentioned, with the advisory board at Chapel Hill here, and even with the center. And this is where I think social media has disavowed the younger demographic a little bit of the importance of networking in the traditional sense, not Instagram, DMing, if you will. And so I think that is really, really, really important. So throughout my entire career, every role that I've gotten has been the result of a networking, a relationship. I've never applied for a job online or posted for, a website. It's always been from my network. And so I think that's a great reflection of the importance of, even early on, identifying potential mentors. It doesn't have to be a full-time commitment that you have someone signed to, meet with you weekly and, plan and brainstorm. Getting connected with people who inspire you, who are doing something in their career that, albeit maybe it'll take you 20 years to get there, but who you admire, who you respect, and connecting with them and staying connected with them is so critical. And I think an underappreciated reality, again, given what social media I think has done to create this view that social media is networking and connecting, which it's at one level, but not really. And so I'd say that's a commitment that I challenge students early on to understand and to double down on, because again, it pays off in spades. The majority of roles are still filled by someone picking up the phone and calling 10 of their friends, or emailing 10 of their friends and asking, hey, do you have a great candidate for this role that I have? And so don't underestimate the power of real connections and staying committed to them, throughout the course of years, and not just, moment, if you will.
Thank you. I do see some questions in the chat, Todd. So I'm going to go to, is it Cherry Wang? You want to unmic? Yeah, great. Please.
Yeah. Thank you. So thank you so much for your time. I'm so glad to be here. I think it's such an unnerving time for all the PR students, especially for me. I'm a first year master's student, so I had no experiences, and the market it's the way it is right now. So my question is that In a lot of the courses and the case studies that we've done, I noticed that oftentimes that bad response, negative responses and criticism are more prevalent than positive ones. So when you have an initiative, for even internally or externally for the brand, how do you really gauge the success or the positive impact of that initiative?
Yeah. So yeah, to your point, again, so we monitor, everything that you could imagine, not just across social channels, but traditional earned. Again, I mentioned this reputation tracking and monitoring that we do globally, and so we're swimming in data, and so I think we have the ability within a moment's notice to unearth how is this decision, this announcement, this product being perceived from China to Europe to Latin America, across the Western Hemisphere, and then slice it in terms of positive, negative, neutral sentiment, the velocity, veracity around claims that are being made. But even beyond all that, very, very tactical data that sometimes can be overwhelming. I look at my dashboard of about 10 KPIs most consistently. One of the things that I look at in terms of this dashboard most are two things. So trust, the trust dimension for us, which across all of these individual data sets that we're tracking, that tells me the degree to which publics will give us the benefit of the doubt. They trust us to do the right thing. Even if we do something stupid tomorrow, that trust KPI is an indicator of how willing are they to even overlook that. Okay, you did something really stupid, but I trust you enough as a brand to believe you when you say you're going to recover by doing X or Y. And so that's an example of, again, us using real verifiable data. And then the other aspect of this dashboard for me that I look at is, again, not too dissimilar from that same concept of trust, but something that's a little more dimensionalized around the benefit of the doubt. And so we track benefit of the doubt globally across 20 markets and against about 10 of our competitors around the world, because benefit of the doubt, similar to trust, but in a little more nuanced way, shows us how much room we have to make mistakes in the future. And so that determines how much damage from a bad decision or a negative reaction. So if consumers on WeChat or Weibo in China react unbelievably negative to something that we've done, that benefit of a doubt metric gives us an indication of how successful could we be most likely at coming back from this if we made a more responsible decision or we changed that decision. And that's an example of, again, the data helping us think through how we make this assessment and then how we recover or not based on all of this unbelievable tracking that we're doing.
And Torod, you gave a great example of that, but what do you use to track benefit of the doubt? Is it the bounce back potential that you're measuring, or?
So this is the reputation tracking that we're doing across these groups. And so we are actually polling online and in person polling these audiences 24/7. So it's real time polling. Mm-hmm. And so we look at that benefit of the doubt data point on a rolling basis, and then use that in terms of the shift, how much that moves from day to week to month to quarter as an indicator of, the decision or the impact or whatever the thing might have been that we're monitoring.
I like that, the benefit of the doubt metric. I'm gonna try to start measuring that myself. Yeah. We have 2 minutes with you. I may put you on the spot and ask you a political question, which is, you were chief communication strategist for the US Congress. And I'm embarrassed to admit, I didn't know that US Congress had a chief communication strategist. And it was in the era of September 11th. If you were in your current job today, or the current variation of that job today, how would you, in your role as the conscience of this organization, as you so eloquently described at the top of this conversation, how would you recommend they communicate their purpose or their value right now?
Yeah, so that's a fascinating question. In 2 minutes, I will solve this problem. But
Take 5, really.
I would say, so that moment after, this was right after 9/11, anthrax, ricin on Capitol Hill, and an effort, Congress is essentially made up of 535 individual CEOs, if you will, who all have PR people, media people, whose roles are almost exclusively focused on getting media, managing media for that CEO, if you will, member of Congress as a CEO. And these lines are divided between D's and R's by and large. So I was recruited to come to Congress again after 9/11 anthrax, as they were building up an organizational competency to drive organizational communications. It's almost the equivalent of creating the entity to run Congress. And so if you think about an organizational finance, organizational HR, organizational IT, so superseding these 535 individual CEOs and their individual PR media people, this was the group that was going to do the grown-up thinking. And so the communication strategy need at that time quite clearly was crisis strategy, business continuity, disaster recovery planning, messaging at the organizational level. And so I would suggest that strangely enough, is a more critical need for this moment. Even though this was not the remit of that organization, I think back to some of the challenges that we're looking at geopolitically and the tension we all feel to be pulled into our tribes and our silos and our segments and our communities is probably influenced more so by the politics of our day, that, to be honest, is more poisonous than it's ever been. I think there's a role to the jobs that we place, the jobs that we have, in helping us understand, again, this shared humanity, this oneness, this unanimity of who we are and what we all value and what matters, that at our highest and best use, politics used to do, could do, and that at some point I think we all believe will be the reality again, because it is so sorely needed. And I think that in and of its essence is the role that I was in for those several years in Congress after these unbelievably painful moments for our nation, where everyone aligned around the equivalent at that time, which was, we are all one, we are all American. And so I think that's as critical today in a different way than it was then around 9/11.
Torod Neptune, thank you so much for spending time with us today, for sharing your wisdom, sharing your insights. It's incredibly generous of you, and we're lucky to have you as a member of the Annenberg family. So thank you very, very much. And everybody can unmute themselves if you want to thank Torod with a round of applause or a goodbye, and enjoy your weekend, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day. And Torod, particularly thank you for that closing thought.